My name is Tony Sonera, and I'm the team leader for the Refugee and Migrant Education Network. Our international gathering today, which starts with this opening session, is in the works for a while. Back in 2018, we said, well, the next time we gather for an international convention would be in the beginning of 2020. And you all know what happened in the beginning of 2020, which became 21, which became 22. But thank you for being with us. There's 155 people who have registered to be here in person for the conference, and approximately another 40 will be connected online. So we'll be from 23 different countries, representing people that work directly in refugee education. We'll have a very important contingent of student refugees who are studying at university level. We'll have folks who are teachers, researchers, activists on behalf of migrants and refugees, and folks who are interested in learning more about our work. In November of 2017, a group of about 70 of us met here to talk about role and responsibilities of universities regarding refugee and migrant issues. In that meeting, one of the objectives that emerged was a desire to keep people connected to one another post-conference. And that led to the formation in 2018 of the Refugee and Migrant Education Network. And in the interim period, because of the pandemic, most of our way of trying to keep the members connected have been through webinars and a monthly newsletter. We took the chance to say, finally, we're going to give this meeting an opportunity to happen in person. I know that all of you had to think seriously about taking the step to come, so thank you very much for doing that. This conference will be successful if we take advantage of our being together. The panel discussions, the workshops, the plenary sessions are, I think, among the best you would ever find at a conference like this. But the key thing will be how we interact with one another, the relationships, the potential cooperations beyond the conference. So please reach out and meet and talk with people who you didn't know when you got here. And then, most importantly, the real success of this conference won't be known for here or in the first weeks or months after the conference. The success of this conference will be, down the line, more people who have been displaced will be able to engage in education that helps in their human development and their human engagement in the world. So the real success will be, will the fruit of this conference be that we've created more opportunities for people who've been displaced to have an education. That's the real long-term goal. And before I introduce Claude Maturney, I'd ask that we just stop for just a moment of silence and be mindful that there are more than 100 million people in the world who are displaced, who have been forced to leave their homes because of war, persecution, violence, climate change, many of them young children, but all 100 million of them people finding themselves in a place that they would not have chosen to be unless they were forced to be there. So just take a moment to remember those folks and to ground ourselves, and that's the reality for so many of our sisters and brothers in the world. Thank you. When we first gathered in the fall of 2016 to plan that conference in 2017, Cardinal Maturney was then Father Maturney, working in the Vatican's Office on Refugee and Migrants. And he and his colleague, Father Baggio, along with several other people that are sitting in this room, played a key role in designing that first conference that then eventually led to our meeting in 2017 and then the birth of the Refugee and Migrant Education Network. When we wrote to Father Cardinal Maturney if he could come and be with us, he very, very graciously said, yes, I can come for a little bit of time at the very beginning. So without any further ado, please welcome Cardinal Maturney.
So during this bit at the beginning, I have a few words to share. So I welcome you to this event entitled Initiatives in Refugee and Migrant Education, Moving Forward, Digging Deeper, Together. First, let's highlight the word together, since it is only by joint efforts that we can achieve and sustain fundamental works of justice, compassion, and human dignity. To give back to migrants and refugees what they have lost by leaving or forcibly fleeing their places of origin. I greet you all, I think also both rectors in Asencia, and thank you, and honor the co-sponsoring institutions, the Refugee Migrant Education Network and the Gregorians Faculty of Social Sciences. So, and to all of you present, hello. I'm grateful to the university community for your commitment to study and research, to teach, and to witness and advocate. I encourage you to adapt the methodology of Gaudium et Spes, tackling problems, not within a deductive framework derived from doctrinal sources, but through an inductive analysis of events. By truly relying on the assistance of the Holy Spirit, such analysis can identify new paths and courageous choices. Thus, there is no single universal solution to the difficulties brought about by today's social realities. For example, the challenges of migrant and refugee education. But each Christian community must take up the task of finding adequate responses to the complexities of its own specific context. Applying this approach to your dialogue among university and other educators, how does your research contribute to seeing more deeply and widely? How does your teaching embody judging what is worth conveying? And how does it form consciences to refine their capacity to judge and to judge wisely? And what is your action, not just as researchers and teachers, but also, for example, as employers and as advocates in civil society? Thus, Catholic social teaching offers a framework that can help you to explore, share ideas, and begin working together. And secondly, there's your motto, moving forward. Nearly 3 years ago, the Holy Father addressed the International Conference for Leaders of Catholic Universities. He said, with your universal openness, that's precisely what universitas is supposed to mean, with your universal openness, you can enable the Catholic University to become a place where solutions for civil and cultural progress for individual persons and for humanity, marked by solidarity, are pursued with perseverance and professionalism. You can also examine that which is contingent without losing sight of that which has more general value. Old and new problems must be studied in their specificity and immediacy, but always within a personal and global perspective. It is in this optic of a committed observatory that we can move forward together in educating refugees and migrants. What do we observe regarding the challenges that they face when it comes to accessing educational opportunities? Some countries lack the resources to provide education to their own citizens, much less to poor newcomers. Other countries, though better resourced, adopt policies that prevent or delay access to education by newcomers. Others erect financial barriers. Additionally, refugees usually lack the free movement needed to take advantage of training and education opportunities. This is why education has to be offered in many locations and circumstances, ideally in purposed institutions, but also in camps and in marginal urban settings where half of the refugee population currently lives. We have many good practices developed by Catholic organizations which could and should be replicated. For example, providing education through technologies and distance learning. Another form of assistance is scholarships for refugees and migrants, which will enable them to flourish and grow. We know that the education gap between refugees and their host community peers can be very wide. It undermines the integration of children into the local community. The situation is especially dire at the higher levels of education. Today, only 5% of refugees have access to post-secondary education and training. But though these learning and educational opportunities are essential to their success, opportunities to work, earn a living, and be self-reliant are the most effective ways for refugees to rebuild their lives. Let me stress self-reliance under the third slogan, digging deeper. Post-secondary education encourages the development of a sustainable livelihood that is not dependent on humanitarian aid. It allows refugees to establish economic independence and a better standard of living, no matter where they are or how long they remain displaced, and it provides better socioeconomic inclusion within their host communities. This is particularly important because the majority of refugees, over 75%, spend at least 5 consecutive years in exile. I'm always struck that by 5 minutes my patience has run out, so it's very hard for me to imagine being stuck somewhere for 5 years. Another important contribution will be the mutual recognition of academic qualifications, not just swapping titles or degrees, among Catholic universities as a concrete way of empowering refugees and migrants. If there are any administrators here, they know that this is a real mouthful. It is not easy to do, but it needs to be done, and it needs to be done well and fairly, not sloppily. The academic and professional competences of refugees and migrants need to be recognized, and this requires appropriate assessment as well as courses of updating and upgrading. It is also important to offer training courses for pastoral agents engaged in many different programs catering to refugees and migrants, and other programs to prepare future policymakers and government executives, introducing modules on migration and asylum in various curricula. In this sense, following the Holy Father's advice, I quote, interdisciplinary approaches, international cooperation, and the sharing of resources, which I guess was the bread and butter of this event, are important elements that can permit universality to translate into shared and fruitful projects on behalf of humanity, of all men and women, and the environment in which they live and grow. Another facet of digging deeper takes up this appeal of the Holy Fathers. Today, we need to remember more than ever that all teaching entails questioning the why. The why. In other words, it calls for reflection on the foundations and purposes of each discipline. Education reduced to mere technical instruction or mere passing on of information becomes an alienated and fragmented education. To believe that we can transmit knowledge without concern for its ethical dimension is essentially to abandon the task of teaching. 3 kinds of language are needed, Pope Francis underlines, and all 3 languages need to come into play. The language of the mind for reflecting and judging, the language of the heart for perceiving, and the language of the hands for acting. We need to think in harmony with what we feel and what we do, to feel in harmony with what we think and do, and to act in harmony with what we feel and think. An overall harmony, never divorced from the whole. Complementing these topics and considerations, let us not overlook the scandal of hostility towards refugees and migrants. It can arise everywhere, even in Catholic and academic communities around the world. It is simply ignorance about the conditions that lead to human displacement, or is it overlooking the contributions that newcomers make to host communities? Can research expose the fears and resistances which feed negative narratives and toxic myths about migrants? An important contribution from universities, like the Gregorian hosting us today, could be a sound, honest assessment of the root causes of contemporary forced migration, highlighting the responsibilities of the leading countries, counterbalancing a narrow understanding of the common good and distributive justice with new ethical assessments, namely the good of all, as in Fratelli Tutti. My dear friends, let me end with the first word, together. Governments, practitioners, communities, educational institutions, the Church, all have complementary responsibilities to provide access to meaningful educational opportunities for refugees and migrants, working hand in hand with a clear mission and generosity of spirit. Why? To offer those who have been uprooted from their homes the opportunity of quality education, to become men and women for others, siblings all, carers of our common home. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful conference. Thank you. And forgive me for fleeing, but I've got another.
Thanks a lot. Good to see you. I'm going to have a number of practical suggestions about the next few days, and I decided I'll give them to you in portions. So the first practical suggestion is, today we're here, and tomorrow we're downstairs. So please, when you arrive tomorrow morning for the opening plenary session at 9 o'clock, go immediately downstairs to the Matteo Ricci Conference Center. As some of you may be familiar with, it's a beautiful setting, and it'll be all ours for the next several days, but downstairs. Secondly, if there are elements in the registration process that some of you still need to complete, I'll remind you again, visit the people at the table. There are protocols for the university and requirements of paperwork that we need to have, and we need to have them done today. So please, if you have any questions about whether you've completed that process, please go to the desk. And thirdly, and last of these practical announcements, for those of you who are hoping or want to come to the audience with Pope Francis on Thursday morning at 9 a.m., we need to know that, so we need you to sign up. And then I'll give more details about that, where we're going to gather and the like. in the course of the next day or two. We're fortunate to have with us Father Mark Lewis, new rector of the Pontifical Gregorian University.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths because I'm coming from another meeting. It's good to see you all. It's good to have you here. So I'll dismiss, since I'm speaking in English, with all of the eminences, excellences, and so on, and just go right to it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all here to the university, to the Pontifical Gregorian University, and to wish you much success in the work that you'll be doing here. I know this event, Initiatives in Refugee and Migrant Education, moving forward, diving deeper together, which has been organized by the Refugee and Migrant Education Network, along with the Faculty of Social Science of our university, has a lot of promise. This is a continuation of work that's been already undertaken. I would have taken a little bit of time to welcome His Eminence Cardinal Maturney. We're old friends from my days studying in Toronto. I know he's very interested in this meeting as well, and is very interested in the work that you all are doing. I'll then jump to the other people to welcome, especially Professor Anthony Chinera, president of the Being the Blessing Foundation and the Center for Interreligious Understanding. And this is a good place where the idea developed and grew for this meeting. And also Tom Smolich, another old friend. We worked together in another lifetime, the director of the Jesuit Refugee Service International. And then to all of the relators, all of the other people who are here to share their reflections and make contributions to these ideas. In reality, we don't lack challenges in what we're doing here. We have opportunities, especially opportunities in education for refugees and others. And the one thing that we've learned fairly early is that we need a network to meet those needs. And I think that's an important aspect of this meeting, because ultimately these kinds of meetings allow us to network. I'm also very happy mentioning this in the participation of representatives who are themselves refugee students, because the scope of this activity, the scope of this initiative, is to think of them and their needs and what they can do. And at this point, I'll just make a little public ad for the IAJU's initiative for global citizenship, which would be another nice tie-in, perhaps, with this meeting. I'd also like to underline another little aspect that I noticed of your meeting, the subtitle, Moving Forward, Diving Deeper, Together. Those three elements are crucial to anything we want to do for others, for the church, for any community. And it's also critical to our education today. We need to move forward together. We need to go deeper. We need to not just get the superficiality of education, but to understand the foundations. And we need to keep moving forward, not staying in one place. That's the challenge, I think, of all education, including this university. So for this reason, I think the university, our university here, the Gregorian, along with the other pontifical universities, really feel called, also from the Pope, to this kind of work, this kind of contribution, to analyze the situation, to see the context in which we are living, and then to begin to plan to construct a different future. So I'd like to thank all of you, especially the people who will be giving talks, that have accepted this invitation and have said yes to this kind of work. And finally, if you allow me to thank and recognize the Faculty of Social Science, especially, in the Department of Moral Theology, Renee McAuliffe, who was very much a center of organizing this, and also our organization of events, Maria Trivolo. So thank you to all of you for coming as friends of this university, and I hope that your mission will be brought forward by this meeting, and that it will be rich, and it will constitute a new step forward and a new network that will help us to do what we need to do in this mission. Thank you.
There's a quiz on all of the talks this afternoon before the cocktail hour. I'm only teasing. Since the first discussions about a conference in 2016, Jesuit Refugee Service has been an integral partner in the design of the 2017 conference, the 2018 conference, the webinars, critical conversations, our newsletter. Frankly, without continuing absolute generous help of JRS, we wouldn't be here today. So it was with great joy that I received Father Tom's response that he would be able to come and join us today and to kick off the conference with the first plenary address. Father Smirlik is a Jesuit from the United States and has had a distinguished academic career and now has the role of being the international director of Jesuit Refugee Service. So Tom, thank you very, very much for coming, and we look forward to your remarks.
Friends, thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you. Mark, thank you for the warm welcome. As Mark said, we've known one another in past lives when Mark still had dark hair and I had hair. It goes a ways back. So thank you on behalf for representing the Greg in terms of the welcome here and in the participation of the faculties. And thanks also to Cardinal Maturney for kicking us off and really focusing on this theme of doing what we do together. And I'd really like to build on that in terms of our coming together for this convocation, working on initiatives in refugee and migrant education. So let me take a glass of water and make two caveats before I begin. First of all, the schedule was that I was supposed to be on the panel, which comes next. But like others, I have something else that I have to do. So Father David Holdcroft from our staff will take my place on the panel. He's more interesting than I am anyway. But more importantly, I will be back for the social hour, which is the most important part of the networking that you have spoken about. Secondly, my address is really, in a sense, focusing on my experience as the head of Jesuit Refugee Service. This is about refugee and migrant education, and I feel unworthy, shall I say, to make comments about migrant education specifically. So allow me to refer to forcibly displaced and refugees. Migrants are part of that larger picture. Those of you who come from a migrant background, listen to what I say, and in the Q&A, which we're going to have in lieu of my being on that panel, if I got something wrong or if you want to add something to it from a migrant point of view, please do so. This will really be your opportunity to do so. So, very grateful to be here with you. And I think it is perhaps a coincidence, I'm not sure, but yesterday was the 108th World Day of Migrants and Refugees celebrated in the church. Most recently moved to the last Sunday in September. And as every pope has done, but especially Pope Francis, there's a message which goes out for World Migrant and Refugee Day. This one was published in May, so it's not exactly a news item. But the theme that Pope Francis gave us this year was building the future with migrants and refugees. As always, an inspiring and challenging message from Pope Francis. I think it provides a good starting point for our reflections on how we work with and on behalf of the millions of forcibly displaced people whom we accompany and serve as educators in a variety of contexts and ways. In that message, Pope Francis is quick to point out how each of those on the margins, and particularly migrants and refugees, can and do contribute to the process of construction, of building a future together, of building the kingdom of God in this world. But I have to tell you that there was one part of his message which especially stayed with me. It was these words: "No one must be excluded. God's plan is essentially inclusive and gives priority to those living on the existential peripheries." God's plan is essentially inclusive. How do we understand that? I think we begin with the obvious reality that while God's plan is inclusive, that is not always, or perhaps not even often, true for us in our world, in our various societies, and even in the church. As a little case study of this, I invite us to reflect a bit on one of the most inclusive events of recent memory: the response to Ukrainian refugees. Those of you who have been in this field a while know that the way the world, particularly Europe and the developed world, have welcomed Ukrainian refugees has been nothing short of incredible. It's a welcome quite different than the welcome given to most refugees in Europe and worldwide. Professor Matthew Gibney of the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford recently reflected on this extraordinary response by, first of all, proposing 4 reasons why society should respond positively to forcibly displaced people. 4 principles, if you will. There's the humanitarian principle. We have a moral duty to help those in dire need. There's the restorative or reparations principle. We helped cause the problem, so we have a duty to make it better. There's the system legitimacy principle. If we do not offer protection, what kind of a society are we? We lack moral authority. And finally, the shared identity principle. They're like us, so we should help. And I think we can see all 3 of these principles operative in the generous response to Ukrainian refugees. Huge humanitarian response from literally all over the world. Women and children, and particularly in need, people were incredibly generous. Certainly, there's been an element of the restorative dimension. It's our dependence on Russian energy that kind of got Ukraine into this place in the first place, so we need to respond. And I think there's the legitimacy issue as well. If we do not help, we are no better than the Russians who have caused this problem in the first place. But Gibney suggests that it's really the shared identity that has made a difference with Ukraine. Europeans and other developed world communities saw Ukrainians as like us. And that's why the doors have been opened in the way that they have. To varying degrees, other forcibly displaced people crossing barriers like the Mediterranean, the Darien Peninsula in Panama, and the mountains between Myanmar and India are not seen quite like us. And frankly, at this moment in our history, the moral weight of humanitarianism, restorative justice, and legitimate government authority seem to be scraping along the bottom. Pope Francis has been an indefatigable advocate of the reality of shared identity. From the first visit of his pontificate to Lampedusa, that little island in the middle of the Mediterranean, to the latest work of art in St. Peter's Square, which I urge you to walk up and touch if you have not seen it, to last year's message on World Migrant and Refugee Day, which invited us to build an ever wider we. Pope Francis is all in on this understanding of shared identity. But his understanding and that of most of the world are not quite on the same wavelength. And unless we are careful, I think we will find ourselves doing the same cherry picking of shared identity that we can easily fall into. Some forcibly displaced people are more worthy than others. Refugees in tertiary education or working for a bachelor's degree are a better investment. Or, I'd rather work with groups of people who don't argue with the way that I want to do things, etc., etc. No one must be excluded. How can we understand that and act that in our broken and fragmented world? I'd like to turn to a different part of Pope Francis' ministry for an insight on this. I followed Pope Francis' recent visit to Canada with a mixture of trepidation and amazement. His goal was to engage Native peoples there on the Church's role in Indigenous residential schools and the multi-level, multi-generational disaster that those were for so many. While no papal visit is perfect, and plenty have parsed its imperfections, Francis' ability to enter into the reality of harm done to the indigenous communities there in the name of the Church was striking. And while he was there, Francis proposed a distinctive understanding of working together to rebuild trust, to make sure that no one is excluded. An understanding which I think is also relevant to our work as refugee migrant educators. It is the lens of reconciliation. What we do as fundamentally participating in the call of reconciliation. In his meeting with Indigenous community members and members of the parish at Sacred Heart Church in Edmonton, Alberta, Francis deeply acknowledged the role that Catholics had in, quotes, policies of assimilation and enfranchisement that inculcated a sense of inferiority, robbing communities and individuals of their cultural and spiritual identity. He went on to say that this was done in the name of an educational system that was supposedly Christian. He then added, thanks be to God, for in parishes like this one, day by day through encounter, foundations are being laid for healing and reconciliation. And he goes on to build the image or build the reality of reconciliation in the image of the cross, the tree of life, on which Jesus accomplished God's plans to reconcile all things, to make sure that no one is excluded. And by Jesus doing that, the church is now, and we are now, a living body of reconciliation. And Francis draws on the linguistic relationship between the word reconcile and counsel, and calling us to see the church as the house where we conciliate, talk with one another anew, where we meet to start over and grow together. Father Raymond D'Souza, in a contribution to the National Catholic Register, put this in ecclesial and human terms. Reconciliation, thus, is not something accomplished by two communities in growing concord, but rather by members of the same community who participate in an authentic communion. What Jesus has done for us is to invite us to be one, so that no one is excluded. And isn't that what we as refugee and migrant educators fundamentally are about? Don't we want to tear down the walls that divide us and get to the deeper experiences of human solidarity, conciliating anew our broken world so that indeed no one, least of all the people that we accompany, no one is excluded? This deep, Christocentric, ecclesial understanding of shared identity is also prophetic. It is not only Ukrainians who are like us, but also Rohingya, people with disabilities, trafficked people, LGBTQ refugees, and anyone else who knows what it is like to be on the outside looking in, so that no one is excluded. Reconciliation, of course, takes many forms. Our own reconciliation work in JRS focuses on principles that allow disparate groups, tribes or national groups within a refugee camp, host communities interacting with refugee communities, to find common ground to build a common life together. Sometimes the work we do has an explicit faith-based dimension, and other times the work is more practical. How do our communities come together to build a new school together? In any case, a rewoven social fabric where exclusion is not the norm is both the context and goal of reconciliation. As refugee educators, how do we incorporate the grace of reconciliation into the work that we do? I want to return to Francis' presentation at Sacred Heart Church. He contrasts the educational system that was supposedly Christian with his definition of the process. Education is an adventure in which we explore and discover together the mystery of life. An adventure in which we explore and discover together the mystery of life. So, considering refugee and migrant education in the context of communal reconciliation, let me propose three aspects. What our forcibly displaced sisters and brothers contribute, what we as educators contribute, and what we build together for a world of reconciliation and inclusion. First, the refugee contribution. If we are indeed part of a single community, as Francis invites us to consider ourselves, it is incumbent to recognize what our sisters and brothers bring to the educational process, and therefore what we do not necessarily have to contribute. Foremost and foundational among what forcibly displaced people bring to these efforts is hope. Now, we all might define hope differently, and the only thing I would say, hope is not optimism. It is not all going to get better tomorrow. Hope is a foundation and is the foundation and horizon in which we operate. The belief that we are being called to fulfillment, and that the Holy One, however we name it, is drawing us there. I say you and I do not have to provide that hope because our refugee brothers and sisters would not be here if they did not have it. To risk all one has by leaving home is ultimately a profound trust in the future, a felt sense of hope that my life can be and will be better. If we're honest, we as educators, we as those accompanying refugee communities can sometimes be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, overwhelmed by the needs, and the seemingly intractable problems. And I think we've all felt that. Those we accompany, however, cannot imagine even being alive without hope. I've come to realize that hope begins with individual lives and stories, and out of those stories being shared, it creates a sense of communal hope which sustains all of us as we move forward. It's a particular gift that by animating individuals is able to animate an entire community. And I want to share a story about this which has become my favorite proof of such a reality. Turn the clock back about 2 years and 4 months to April 2020, when the COVID phenomenon was sweeping over our world. The scene is Kakama Camp in northern Kenya. A Sri Lankan Jesuit, Father Lasantha Debrew, had just celebrated Sunday Mass, talking about what comes with COVID. And after that, a Congolese refugee named Charité came up and shared his perspective on the pandemic. He told Lasantha, "Father, there is no need to be anxious. You fear because of uncertainties. We, as refugees, experienced these uncertainties from the moment we started running away. When we took the first step from our lands, we did not know the future. Those were dark, uncertain moments. We lost everything, but God saved us. So still, we are living. We do not know the future, but we know that God will care for us. Even when we die with God who loves and cares for us." If we've got hope, that's a bonus. We do not need to bring hope, but to cherish and kindle the hope that is there. What is our contribution? As our forcibly displaced partners bring hope, what do we bring? I want to suggest that the most important contribution is deeper than the studies and the skills we have developed, deeper than the educational systems and structures and expertise that we bring in genuine service. Underneath it all is something like what I would like to call #Refugee Lives Matter. #Refugee Lives Matter. I presume you are all aware of the Black Lives Matter campaign in the USA, a loose coalition that highlights the racism, discrimination, and inequality experienced by black people there. While one may critique some of the aspirations of some of the coalition partners, Black Lives Matter, or BLM as it's called, puts the reality of exclusion on the table. Now some, including some of our church leaders, have responded by saying that BLM is off the tracks. It should be that all lives matter. And while that statement is true, all lives matter, it misses the point. Documentable evidence shows that black lives matter less in the USA, and to some people, not at all. Society does not see black people as equal parts, as equal participants in our communities. They are other, and therefore not part of the communal calculus. If black lives are not considered equally among all lives, that inclusion needs to be done first. If we go around saying all lives matter, we are omitting those lives. And so it is with forcibly displaced people, and I think most migrants throughout the world. Ukrainians accepted, forcibly displaced people do not count. If they did, it would be a scandal that so many die in the Mediterranean each year. It would be a scandal that children have been repeatedly separated from their parents at the southern USA border. And it would be a scandal that Giorgia Meloni is likely the next Prime Minister of Italy. Hashtag Refugee Lives Matter. What we do as educators affirm that these children, these women, and these men are part of our community. When we develop programs to keep girls in school, develop technologies for blended and online learning, develop learning programs so that children with disabilities and children who have fallen far behind are not forever left behind, these are all concrete ways of expressing that hashtag. We may not want to think of ourselves as political actors, and we are. The art of politics is getting others to see things as we see them. And isn't that the acknowledgement of our forcibly displaced sisters and brothers foundational to what we do and believe? Our societies need to be reconciled, to be brought together as one. By what we do and in the way that we do it. We are advocates for saying refugee lives matter. Everyone's life matters. No one should be excluded. And finally, what do we do together? Hope, refugee lives matter. What do we do together with those that we accompany and serve? I want to return to yesterday's message on World Migrant and Refugee, on World Day with Migrants and for Migrants and Refugees. Building the future with migrants and refugees is the theme. Each of us here knows and believes and has staked our lives on the fact that education plays an essential component in building a future. As we look at how we develop educational programs in dialogue with our beneficiaries, our students, I think it is important to bring our expertise in dialogue with those we serve so that the education that we build together meets their needs and aspirations. And I think this is very important because two things have radically changed in the last decade plus vis-a-vis our forcibly displaced communities. First of all, displacement lasts a long time. Cardinal Maturney mentioned the idea of 5 years, that 75% of refugees are away from home for 5 years. The statistics are even grimmer. If you are away from home for 5 years, you are more than likely going to spend 20 years displaced. The length of displacement has grown huge. And the second point, once again accepting Ukrainians and for a brief moment, Afghanis, resettlement is not a realistic possibility for the vast majority of the people that we accompany and serve. That scraping the bottom of the moral boat is a reality when it comes to resettlement right now. Therefore, our educational efforts need to lead to viable and dignified outcomes where people are, not where they used to be, not where we might like them to get, or sometimes where they would like to imagine themselves going. The building of the kingdom here and now, part of yesterday's message, requires a dialogue among educators and students as to what that kind of education looks like. And so we are called to be partners in dialogue, partners in building a sense of reconciliation among all of us. If my future is in Addis Ababa or Delhi, what I need to learn needs to bring me dignity there. And if I am educating a young woman in Zalika camp in Malawi or in Bangkok, I need to give her the tools that fit her life, not what I am most comfortable with or what we have always done. This growing sense of dialogue has very much been part of our work at JRS over the past few years. We recently did a mini revision of our strategic framework. And for the first time, we joined education and livelihoods as a single program priority. Now, I know those of you with a humanitarian background know that education is one bucket and livelihoods is a different bucket. But by listening to the stories of those we accompany, we've become clear, as they have, that the education and training that we offer has to make a difference as they build their lives here, not there or in some future anywhere. For example, I am particularly proud of one of our efforts in Kenya to improve tertiary education outcomes among refugees and local students. David will be talking about that later in the week. The most important proof that this program is working is that a majority of our students are eating better than they did before the program began. When people tell me, what do refugees want for their future? I say they want to put food on the table and send their children to school. A very human thing to want to do. And as I share this call to dialogue, to building a sense of doing this together, I share the story knowing that we, JRS, maybe others, but I'll own JRS, we have failed at times. Years ago, we ran a livelihoods program to train displaced Iraqi men in Kurdistan, in northern Iraq, to become barbers. We did such a good job training barbers that we torpedoed the market with an oversupply of barbers. They couldn't make a living. When I asked one of our staff members about this problem, the response was, well, at least they had a good experience in class. Not acceptable. I suspect we all have our version of that story. And I think that highlights two realities. Accountability to those we educate is paramount. They deserve the best we can offer. And secondly, at times, we need to ask forgiveness as well. The need for reconciliation is a reality in our world and in our work. We as educators with forcibly displaced people have a particular contribution to make to the fulfillment of God's harmonious plan that Francis described in yesterday's message. And as I close, let me read in full what Francis had to say in Edmonton in the context of Indigenous schools and the damage they did. Acknowledging asking forgiveness for the failure there, he also had this to say about our mission. Education must always start from respect and the promotion of talents already present in the individuals. It is not, nor can it ever be, something prepackaged and imposed. For education is an adventure in which we explore and discover together the mystery of life. We are graced as educators to be called to this work, to be called to reconcile, to be called to conciliate anew with the human family so that no one is excluded. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you today. Thanks.